James and Olivia Patterson had it all: success, beauty, and a family that seemed untouched by tragedy. But when their daughter Emily vanished without a trace, the perfect life they'd built began to unravel. What started as a desperate search for a missing teen soon spiraled into a chilling murder investigation that would expose a betrayal so deep it shattered their world, and their darkest secrets were about to be revealed. In a small, picturesque town nestled between rolling hills, the Patterson family seemed like the embodiment of success and happiness. James Patterson, a distinguished architect known for his impressive designs, had built a career that brought him both respect and wealth. His wife, Olivia, was a talented photographer who had made a name for herself through art exhibitions and high-profile weddings. Together, they had 3 children: Emily, Daniel, and Lily. The Pattersons were admired by their neighbours, known for their elegance, warmth, and the sense of togetherness that radiated from their family. James and Olivia's relationship seemed perfect to those around them. They were a team, supportive, loving, and seemingly immune to the challenges that life often throws at people. Their marriage was the kind of partnership that others aspired to, and their children appeared equally picture-perfect. Emily, the eldest, was a 17-year-old high school senior with bright eyes and an even brighter future. She was known for her academic excellence, her natural charisma, and her involvement in various extracurricular activities. Teachers loved her, and her friends admired her. She was the epitome of the perfect teenager, driven, charming, and kind-hearted. Daniel and Lily, the younger children, were also thriving in their own right. Daniel, a 14-year-old sports enthusiast, had dreams of becoming a professional basketball player, and Lily, only 11, had shown a surprising talent for painting that made her the pride of her parents. The family would often gather around their large, warm kitchen table at night, sharing meals and stories, laughing about the day's events. They seemed to have everything that others could only dream of: a beautiful home, a loving relationship, and children destined for greatness. But beneath the surface, things were not as perfect as they appeared. Emily, despite her outwardly perfect life, had begun to withdraw in the months leading up to her disappearance. She had always been the social butterfly, surrounded by friends and activities, but lately, something had changed. She stopped attending the after-school hangouts with her friends, and when she did attend, she was distant. Her bright eyes, once full of excitement and curiosity, seemed to hold a quiet sadness. Her parents noticed the shift but assumed it was just typical teenage behavior, a phase she would soon outgrow. However, as time went on, the distance between Emily and her family grew. She became more secretive, spending long hours locked away, in her room, headphones in, avoiding conversations with her parents. Olivia would occasionally knock on her door, only to be met with short, clipped answers. James, consumed with his busy work schedule and his personal projects, didn't pay much attention to these subtle signs. He chalked it up to Emily, simply, needing her space as she prepared for college. The truth, however, was far more complicated. Emily was struggling with something far darker than anyone could have imagined. She was battling feelings of isolation, pressure from both her parents' high expectations and her own desires to succeed. What no one knew was that Emily had been carrying a secret, one that she felt too ashamed to share with anyone. Despite the family's outward appearance of perfection, there was a growing tension within her heart that no one had noticed until it was too late. Emily had begun to feel like an outsider in her own life, unable to reconcile the image of perfection with the loneliness she felt inside. Her parents, wrapped up in their own world, didn't realize the storm brewing beneath the surface. The bonds that had once held them together were now slowly starting to unravel, and Emily's silence was a reflection of the growing chasm between her and the people who should have been her closest allies. It began like any other evening, or at least it should have. The evening sky had started to shift into shades of orange and pink, casting a warm glow across the Patterson family's elegant home. Emily had just finished her final exams and was looking forward to the summer break. Her parents, who were busy preparing dinner in the kitchen, assumed she was out with her friends, as she often did after school. But when the clock ticked past 7 p.m., Emily hadn't come home. It was unusual. She had always been punctual. Even if she was late, she would call or send a quick text. But there was no word from her. James and Olivia tried not to panic, dismissing it as a typical teenage lapse in time. Maybe Emily had lost track of it, they reasoned. But as the minutes dragged on, their unease began to grow. By 8 p.m., they started calling her friends, but no one had seen her. Olivia remembered that Emily had mentioned a study group earlier in the day, so she tried reaching out to the other students in the group. No one had heard from her since school ended. James suggested they wait a bit longer, that maybe she'd lost track of time or gone to a friend's house and simply forgotten to check in. But by 9 p.m., the feeling of dread settled in. Emily's absence was no longer just a harmless delay. The quiet house felt suddenly too big, too empty. Olivia couldn't sit still. She grabbed her coat and went to the nearby park where Emily often liked to go, but there was no sign of her. The same search was repeated at the places Emily liked to hang out. None of her friends knew where she was, and none had heard from her. The phone calls to the authorities were placed shortly after 10 p.m. The sheriff's office responded swiftly, and soon the small town was buzzing with the news of Emily's disappearance. It was almost surreal. This was a town where everyone knew everyone, where nothing ever went wrong. How could a teenager simply vanish without a trace? As the night deepened into morning, law enforcement began their search, canvassing the neighborhood and local areas. Police officers, volunteers, and search dogs were dispatched into the woods surrounding the town, an area Emily was known to frequent on her walks. But as the hours turned into days, the search efforts were unfruitful. There was no sign of her, no clue, no trail. The community, once brimming with life, became steeped in fear. People began speculating. Had she run away? Was she in danger? There was talk of kidnapping, rumors of a stranger in town. A few people suggested that maybe Emily had simply decided to leave, to escape the pressures that were becoming too much for her. But her family refused to entertain that notion. Olivia and James were convinced that something had happened to her, something beyond her control. Emily was not the type to simply disappear without a word. She would never have left without saying goodbye to her family, especially not without taking her phone. As the search continued, emotions ran high. The tension between hope and fear was palpable in the small town. The Patterson family's perfect image, once admired by all, had begun to crack. Friends, family, and even strangers came together to help. Yet the growing uncertainty hung over them all. What had happened to Emily? Where was she? And more hauntingly, who had taken her? Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of Emily. The Patterson family, once known for their harmony, began to unravel as the dark cloud of uncertainty took hold. And with each passing day, the truth of what had really happened to Emily remained hidden, as elusive as the girl who had vanished without a trace. Just over a month after Emily's disappearance, hope began to fade, but the town of Marlow still hadn't given up on finding her. The search had turned from urgent efforts to a long, tedious investigation, filled with dead ends and unanswered questions. Despite the passing weeks, Olivia and James remained glued to their phones, clinging to the possibility that someone, somewhere, would have a clue that could bring their daughter home. But their hope was starting to wane. The authorities had exhausted their leads. The community's energy had shifted from searching to speculating, and the constant questions, "Have you heard anything? What do you think happened?" only made the pain of waiting more unbearable. The sheriff's office continued to organize sporadic search parties, combing the nearby forests, local parks, and the nearby riverbank. But Emily was still nowhere to be found. At night, Olivia would sit in Emily's room, clutching her daughter's favorite blanket, staring at the empty bed. The silence was deafening. James, on the other hand, immersed himself in work, diving into projects that took him away from home, for long hours, away from the reminders of what they'd lost. Then, on a cold autumn morning, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local hiker, out for an early morning trek through the woods that bordered the town, stumbled upon something that caught his eye. Among the fallen branches and leaves, he saw a glint of something metallic. It was Emily's phone, cracked and partially buried under the debris. The hiker, shaken by the discovery, immediately called the police, and within hours, officers arrived at the scene. The discovery of Emily's phone sent the investigation into a new direction. It was an unexpected piece of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough to draw any immediate conclusions. However, it was enough to convince the police that they were close. Emily hadn't just run away or disappeared on her own. She had been here. She had been in these woods. The phone was examined, and while it had been damaged, forensic experts were able to retrieve messages, photos, and some of the call logs from the past few days before her disappearance. Nothing stood out as overtly suspicious, but the timeline of her phone activity raised more questions. It appeared that Emily had been in contact with someone in the days leading up to her disappearance, someone who, at the time, had been unknown to the family. Following the hiker's discovery, the police expanded their search, focusing more intently on the area around where the phone was found. After a few days of digging, they uncovered a shallow grave, partially concealed by leaves and branches. The body of a young woman, lifeless and cold, was discovered there, only a few hundred yards from the location of the phone. The police confirmed it was Emily. The shock rippled through the town. How could this happen in Marlow, a place where nothing ever went wrong? Emily's body was found with signs of a violent struggle, her clothes torn, her arms marked with bruises. The cause of death was ruled to be multiple stab wounds. It was clear that she hadn't just run away, she had been murdered. As the news spread, people began to speculate wildly. Who would want to hurt Emily? She had been so well liked, so kind-hearted. Her friends, teachers, and even strangers spoke of her in glowing terms. No one could understand who could harbor enough hate to do something so cruel. Rumors swirled through the town. There was talk of a potential stalker, of people who had seen strange figures in the woods. Some even suggested that Emily's disappearance might have been tied to something darker, something that no one in the close-knit town could have ever imagined. But while the town tried to make sense of the brutal murder, the police were left with few leads. Emily's family was devastated, their world shattered. James and Olivia struggled to comprehend the horror that had befallen their daughter. Each new piece of evidence only seemed to deepen the mystery, making them question not only who had done this to their child, but why no one had seen the signs before it was too late. And in the midst of their grief, one haunting question lingered in the air. Was this a crime committed by a stranger, or was the truth far closer to home than anyone had dared to believe? As the investigation into Emily's murder deepened, the authorities turned their attention to her personal life, trying to uncover any clues that might point to the identity of her killer. Emily had always been a good student, popular among her peers, and seemingly content with her life. But as they sifted through her belongings, they discovered something shocking: hidden messages, emails, and texts between Emily and her high school teacher, Robert Collier. He was a 35-year-old English teacher at the local high school, a man with a reputation for being quiet and professional. At first glance, he seemed like an unlikely suspect, well-respected, married with no known history of troubling behavior. But as investigators dug further, it became clear that there was more to this relationship than met the eye. Emily and Mr. Collier had been secretly communicating for months. Their messages, once uncovered, revealed a complex and secretive connection that appeared to go far beyond a simple student-teacher rapport. Their exchanges were often flirtatious, even intimate at times, and there was a clear emotional attachment on both sides. Emily, who had always been close to her parents, seemed to have grown more distant in the months before her death. She had become more withdrawn, spending hours alone in her room, and it now seemed likely that her connection with Mr. Collier had been a significant part of this shift. The nature of their relationship raised serious questions. Had Mr. Collier taken advantage of Emily's vulnerability? Had he crossed professional boundaries in a way that was not just inappropriate, but dangerous? As investigators pieced together the timeline of their interactions, it became clear that Emily's relationship with him had become more intense in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The two had exchanged dozens of private messages in the days just before Emily went missing. Their communications were coded and secretive, suggesting that Emily had been hiding something from her family. When Robert Collier was interviewed, his reaction was calm and measured. He denied any inappropriate behavior with Emily, insisting that their relationship had been nothing more than a friendly mentorship. According to him, Emily had come to him for advice on her future, and their conversations were simply an extension of that. However, the investigators weren't buying it. They questioned how a teacher and student, despite a professional relationship, could have exchanged such personal and intimate messages without crossing a line. A deeper look into Collier's past revealed that he had no criminal record, but there were a few things that raised eyebrows. He had a history of being overly protective of his students and had been known to keep close tabs on certain individuals. He had even been seen spending an unusual amount of time with Emily outside of school hours, offering to help her with assignments, and even giving her rides home on occasion. This behavior, though not overtly illegal, began to paint a troubling picture. Despite the mounting evidence, there was still no concrete proof that Collier had harmed Emily. He had an alibi for the day she disappeared, and there was no physical evidence linking him directly to the crime scene. But the more investigators looked into his behavior, the more they became convinced that there was more to the story than Collier was letting on. He had been the last person to see Emily before she vanished. Surveillance footage from the school parking lot showed Emily and Mr. Collier leaving together late one afternoon, but no one knew where they had gone after that. It seemed that Emily's relationship with Robert Collier was the key to unraveling the mystery of her death. But as the trial date loomed closer, a shocking twist occurred that left everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the case. Just as the prosecution was building its case against Collier, a crucial piece of evidence came to light, something that completely shifted the investigation in a direction no one had expected. Collier, once the prime suspect, would now find himself fighting a battle not just for his innocence, but for his very life. The truth about what had really happened to Emily Patterson was far more twisted and heartbreaking than anyone had dared to imagine. The trial against Robert Collier was set to begin, but just as the prosecution was about to present its strongest case, something unexpected turned the investigation on its head. A breakthrough in the forensic analysis of Emily's body revealed a shocking detail. The wounds on Emily's body were not consistent with the profile of a stranger. Forensic experts had carefully examined the injury patterns and discovered something chilling. The type of stab wounds, the angle of the blows, and the force used to inflict them pointed to someone who had been emotionally involved with Emily, someone who had known her well enough to get close enough to overpower her. The attack was personal, intimate, and far more brutal than anyone had anticipated. This new revelation led investigators to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about the case. Emily's relationship with Mr. Collier, while inappropriate and troubling, began to seem less likely as the key to her murder. The forensic evidence suggested that the killer had been someone close to her, someone who had been able to get inside her world without raising suspicion. It became increasingly clear that Emily's murder had not been the result of a teacher-student scandal gone wrong, but rather the actions of someone far more intimately connected to her life. The investigation took an unexpected turn when detectives started looking deeper into the Patterson family. They re-examined James Patterson's behavior during the investigation, noting that he had been acting strangely since the moment his daughter was reported missing. At first, James had been the picture of a grieving father, overwhelmed by the disappearance of his daughter. But as the weeks passed, his behavior began to raise red flags. He had been evasive during interviews, rarely spoke about Emily in a way that seemed genuinely emotional, and his alibi for the day she disappeared was surprisingly vague. Police also uncovered financial records that revealed James was under a great deal of stress. His business, once thriving, had begun to falter in recent years. A series of failed projects and mounting debts had left him on the brink of financial ruin, something he had kept hidden from his family. Emily, it turned out, had been aware of her father's financial troubles. She had discovered his secret debts and had even confronted him about them, threatening to expose the truth to her mother. James, terrified of losing his family's respect and the image of perfection he had built for himself, had become desperate. When investigators learned about the confrontation between James and Emily, just days before her disappearance, they began to piece together the shocking truth. Emily had been planning to tell Olivia everything about her father's secret financial struggles, about the pressure he had placed on her to keep up the illusion of their perfect life. The more they dug, the more it became clear that James had seen Emily as a threat to the facade he had worked so hard to maintain. It was then that the detectives made the most horrifying discovery of all. James had been the last person to see Emily alive. On the evening of her disappearance, he had driven her out to the woods under the guise of talking things through. But instead of offering a father's reassurance, James had snapped. In a fit of rage over the thought of his daughter revealing his secrets, he had attacked her. The brutal nature of the crime, the stabbings, was not just an act of violence, but a desperate attempt to silence her forever. Emily had been murdered by the very person who was supposed to protect her. When James was arrested, the shock was felt deeply across the town. The perfect father, the successful architect, the man everyone had admired, had turned out to be capable of the most unimaginable betrayal. The Patterson family's seemingly perfect life was shattered beyond repair. The community, once trusting and tight-knit, was now fractured. No one could understand how a father could commit such a horrific crime, especially against his own flesh and blood. James's trial would be a media sensation, but it wasn't the legal proceedings that would haunt the town most. It was the truth that came with them. The perfect family, the perfect life, had been nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. And when that lie was exposed, it led to the most tragic outcome imaginable. The world would never forget the heartbreaking murder of Emily Patterson, a case that showed how easily the darkness can hide behind the most dazzling of facades.